In this week's story, people around Britain start dying in mysterious circumstances. A police inspector is tasked with trying to find out why. The first known victim was Alice Pearson of Flint Road, Bath. She was found dead, face down, in a patch of nettles. Her autopsy turned up numerous anomalous and contradictory facts. There were signs of some unknown systemic poison, and yet no toxin could be found in her stomach, nor did her skin bear any needle marks. Her lung tissue appeared normal, and the fluid that had collected in her lungs showed no sign of chemical contamination. Another 4 victims appeared in various locations around Britain, yet at first no connection was made by the police. Another 2 victims appeared in northern France, but this was only discovered much later. The real breakthrough occurred thanks to PC Darren Ford. While assisting in combing the area for clues where a Lancashire man had fallen and died for no clear reason, he too became dizzy. Within 2 minutes he collapsed, and by the time the ambulance arrived, he was quite dead. Dr. Steele noticed the nettle rash on his ankle, but at first thought nothing of it. It was only when the autopsy failed to turn up any clear cause of death and the toxicology reports came back negative that she returned to it, taking tissue samples and sending them off for nuclear magnetic resonance analysis. These peaks indicate the presence of an exotic substance not normally found in human tissue nor in nettle stings, she said, pointing at the NMR graph with a pencil. What kind of substance? Said Chief Inspector Parsons, preening his moustache thoughtfully. It's impossible to say, said Steele. We're sending it for further analysis. It may not be possible to completely identify it, but we should be able to gain further insight. Parsons had one of his underlings search the database for similar cases, and it was this search that turned up Alice and the other 3. 2 of them had already been cremated, but Alice was exhumed, along with a teenager from Berwick by the name of Joel Smith. They both have nettle stings, said Steele, while Parsons paced around her office. In both cases, the NMR showed the same signature. I think you should have the biohazard people collect the nettles. It's already done, said Parsons. We'll know by tomorrow. Professor Reuben Granville seemed positively excited. In 40 years I've never seen anything like this, Inspector, he said, standing up from the microscope. The plant's cells are all morphologically normal, but they are not normal, not at all. What's not normal about them? Asked Parsons. These nettles have been genetically modified in a most ingenious manner, said Granville. A completely new gene has been inserted, one we've never seen before. A gene that does not exist in nature, and it expresses a completely novel poison. I wish I could meet whoever did this. Whoever did this is a genius of the highest order. You should be thankful you haven't met the sick mind behind this, said Parsons. But do you mean to say a single individual could be responsible? Granville froze, suddenly immersed in thought. That's a very interesting question, he said. After a minute had passed, when Inspector Parsons was beginning to wonder if Granville had forgotten his presence, Granville said, Most likely this is the work not of an individual, but a state. Only a state would be able to pull together this kind of scientific innovation, or if not a state, then a highly organised group of extremely dedicated individuals. Not one person then, said Parsons. You understand this will determine our whole line of inquiry. We need to know if we're looking for one man or an organisation, or whether we ought to consider this a job for MI6. I can't be sure, said Granville. All I can say is that if this is the work of one man, or woman, said Parsons. Or woman, said Granville, then we are dealing with a genius of the stature of Einstein or Darwin. I see. The British government swung into action immediately, implementing a national testing programme for nettles and destroying any plants that were found to be contaminated. To the nation's horror, more than 40 contaminated patches of nettles were found. Parsons took it upon himself to make a personal friend out of Granville, also far as was compatible with his duties as a Chief Inspector of Scotland Yard. "I just don't understand why there haven't been more deaths when these vile things are so widespread," he said to Granville as they sat in a quiet bar in Oxford. "It may be significant that the poisonings started happening quite suddenly," said Granville. "It could be that the nettle stings only become toxic at a certain stage of development, but my fear is that our adversary has been considerably more inventive than that." "What do you mean?" "4 poisonings within a week, and you say there's been another 3 since then?" "Make that 4. 8 in total. We've got another suspected case on the books now, just come in." "8 cases," said Granville. "Even though there's been a huge national effort to find and destroy modified nettles for a week now, and before 2 weeks ago, absolutely nothing." "As far as we've been able to tell." "What are you driving at?" "It may be that the plants have been programmed to become active on a certain date, perhaps in response to some external cue." "Is that possible?" "Possible, yes. For example, certain species of cicada all emerge at the same time, and there are flowers that bloom on the same day once a year. The precise details of how this occurs are unknown to us, but the organisation you're looking for may have solved this puzzle." "The more I think about this, the more it seems like a job for MI6. This has got to be the Russians or the Chinese, or almost any other state that isn't too keen on Britain." The task that faced the British government seemed insurmountable. Nettles, as any British child knows, are found everywhere in Britain. Vast teams of volunteers were organised to gather samples from nettles everywhere, and although numerous patches of modified nettles were found and destroyed, their distribution seemed entirely random, and all nettles had to be viewed with suspicion. Week by week, the death toll continued to mount. Anyone stung by an infected nettle died almost immediately, with a mortality close to 100%. In the summer of that year, the death rate reached a terrible peak, with 20 people dying every week. But thereafter the situation was gradually brought under control, and the death rate declined. Every parent taught their children to beware of nettles, and every dog walker took to wearing protective plastic sheaths around their shins. And then, in August, a terrifying new threat emerged. "Inspector," said Sergeant Blake, his face pale as he listened to the voice at the other end of the telephone. "Mass poisoning in Surrey, and we've got a few cases in Norfolk and Leicestershire." "Give me that," said the inspector, grabbing the phone out of Blake's hand. The voice on the other end, the voice of Dr. Rachel Enfield, only confirmed what Blake had summarised. People in several areas of Surrey were dying, by the dozens, and the cause of death was so obscure that it immediately reminded people of the nettle cases. "Have any of them been stung?" barked the inspector. "None of them have been stung," said Enfield. "Is the poison centre on this?" "Of course." "Call my mobile if there's any news," said Parsons, and he slammed the phone down. "Get me Granville," he barked at Sergeant Blake. "He's on holiday," said Blake. Parsons swore and made agonised fists in the air. "Where the bloody hell has he gone on holiday?" "Cornwall, Inspector." "Oh, thank heavens for small mercies. Then have a couple of coppers bring him here pronto." By the time Granville arrived at Scotland Yard, there were over 150 confirmed deaths in Surrey, 30 in Norfolk, 20 in Leicestershire, and more cases were emerging by the hour around the country. Parsons was in his office, frantically making phone calls, when a junior officer knocked on his door and then opened it. "Granville for you, Inspector," he said, and Reuben Granville was ushered in, a little dishevelled and red in the face. "Sorry about your holiday," said Parsons. "Have a seat." "I quite understand," said Granville. "I've been following the news. It's horrific. It's abominable." "None of them were stung by nettles. This is something new. They're testing everything, the air, the water, all common foods, a bunch of uncommon foods. At the moment we're powerless to stop the deaths. We can't tell people not to eat and drink. Quite. Have you tested the wheat? Wheat? Why wheat? Well, it's harvest time. Parsons blinked heavily. Why has no one else told me this? He said, and he picked up the phone and called Porton down. Parsons here. Put Crenshaw on the line. I don't care. Put him on the line now. There was a pause, during which Parsons drummed his fingers on the desk impatiently. No one told me they harvest wheat in August, he said to Granville. How would I know? I grew up in the middle of a town. The line clicked. Crenshaw, said the inspector. Did you know they're harvesting wheat? Have you got the results in for wheat flour? What? Well, do it now, man. Don't you people ever stop and think? He slammed the phone down angrily. You know, I have very high blood pressure, he said to Granville. My wife wants me to become a vegetarian. When will we know about the wheat? Asked Granville. Probably an hour. I'll have someone bring you a tea or coffee. Half an hour later, Parsons received a call. When he put the phone down, he was white as a sheet. Granville was still sitting there in his office, and they had spent half an hour speculating wildly. It's the wheat all right, he said. They found the same gene in that that's in the nettles. And the nuclear resonance thing, NMR, said Granville. That shows the same signature. What will happen now? All the wheat fields will have to be tested. Any infected wheat will have to be destroyed. All the flour will have to be checked. We're in a hell of a fix, and who knows what's next. Still no leads? Asked Granville. Parsons shook his head. We don't even know what we're dealing with, never mind who or how many there are of them. The last thing Sandra could remember was helping an elderly man put his shopping in his car, and even that was hazy. She awoke from a deep sleep to find herself in a brick-lined room, almost a perfect cube, with sides of about 3 meters in length. At first she was too groggy to panic, but as her full consciousness returned, she began to panic. There was a grimy plastic-covered mattress for her to lie on at one side, and at the other side, a tap running into a drain, a bucket, and a roll of toilet paper. The only light came from a single light fitting, high up in the ceiling. At the front of the cell was a steel door, studded with metal rivets. In the middle of the door was a small hatch, which was firmly closed, and apart from that and the rivets, the door presented a cold and impassive blank facade. She began to bang on it, shouting and crying. Then she checked her pockets and tried to find her phone, but it was gone, along with her jacket. So she resumed banging desperately on the door. When her cries still hadn't produced any response after about an hour, she sat down on the mattress and sobbed helplessly. After a further half hour, she decided she had to pull herself together. At home, her husband and daughter would be waiting for her. They would soon notify the police, if they hadn't already. She had been picking up a few groceries on her way home from work when she had spotted the old man trying and failing to lift a large container of mineral water into the boot of his little car, and she had volunteered to help him. He had accepted gratefully. She could remember hoisting the container into the open boot, but after that, she could remember nothing. He must have hit her head, but upon feeling her head, she could detect no sore spot. Then he must have drugged her. But why? The possible answers to that question made her feel sick to the pit of her stomach, and she decided to try not to think about it. Best case, he was just lonely and had a very strange way of connecting with people. She examined the cell carefully, but she could see no possible way out of it. The cement holding the bricks in place was fairly new, and she doubted whether she could make much of an impact on it, even if she possessed a chisel, which she didn't. The door didn't even have a handle, and seemed firmly locked. In a far calmer tone of voice than previously, She shouted, "Is anyone there?" But there was no reply. She tried sitting very still and listening for signs of life, but she could hear nothing. Surely the air in the cell must be coming from somewhere. The air was fresh and not at all stale. She couldn't see any sign of a ventilation grill, and finally concluded that the air must be piped around the edge of the light fitting, or else it was coming up through the drain, even though she could feel no draft there. The light was too high to reach, and there was nothing she could use to climb up there. If only, she thought, there had been a metal-framed bed in the cell. Instead, there was only a soft, thin mattress. The drain consisted of a sturdy metal grill with a small pipe visible behind it. It looked as though her captor, presumably the old man, intended to keep her alive for a while. So she concluded that whatever she might do to escape would have to be done when he came to give her food or water. The old man hadn't appeared very strong. That was why she had volunteered to help him, after all. Of course, he had probably been putting on an act, and wasn't nearly so frail as he looked, but she felt she had at least a slim chance of overpowering him if she could just get at him. For what seemed like a very long time, and must have been at least 2 days, she saw and heard no one. She drank water from the tap, which she discovered automatically turned itself off for perhaps half an hour after dispensing a few litres. She was too anxious to feel properly hungry, but she desperately wanted to see someone, anyone. Finally, she heard footsteps echoing steadily towards the cell. She began to shout feverishly, "Hey, who are you? What's going on?" A door opened, and she heard the sound of objects being placed on the floor outside the cell door. But no matter what she said, no reply came to her questions and demands. After a minute, the door shut and the footsteps retreated. She shouted after them wildly, but to no effect. After the footsteps had ceased and she was plunged back into silence, an electronic lock buzzed and the door to her cell sprung open slightly. She grabbed the edge of it and yanked it open. In front of her was a loaf of cheap bread in a plastic wrapper, some cheese, an empty bucket, and a note. Beyond that lay another steel door, identical to the one that barred the exit from her cell. She ran to it and pounded on it, but it wouldn't open. Giving up, she seized the note and read it eagerly, her heart beating fast. It was typed and all in capital letters. It said, "Place the old bucket here. Take the food back into your room." After another futile attempt to open the outer door, she despondently complied. No sooner had she done so than the door to her cell pulled itself shut and locked. An hour later the footsteps returned and her mysterious captor collected the bucket she had left in the little corridor between the two doors. Whoever it was apparently intended not to interact with her at all, at least for the moment. Again she collapsed on the mattress and cried. "I wish I could suggest something, but I really can't think of anything useful other than what I've already suggested," said Granville, as he and Parsons walked back from a cafe where they had eaten lunch together. "We've already checked every PhD with relevant research experience in the entire country," said Parsons. "Either none of them know anything, or they're very good at keeping it to themselves. France, Germany and a bunch of other countries have done the same. The Dutch came back with one fellow they thought was suspicious, but it turned out he's in a psychiatric hospital and has been for the past 3 years. And there's really no useful intelligence on the Russians. I've told you most of what I know. The problem with the Russians is they're cagey, and there's quite a few who might be capable of something like this. The other problem is, it just wouldn't make much sense. Every once in a while they assassinate one of their former spies, someone they consider a traitor, on British soil, but they haven't really all that much to gain from weakening Britain like this. Word on the street is MI6 think it's Iran. They're denying it, of course. If we manage to obtain any definite evidence, it'll be war. I'm amazed there haven't been breakouts anywhere else, to be honest with you. There probably would have been if every country in Europe wasn't testing wheat and nettles like there's no tomorrow. A lot of them are playing their cards close though. They don't want to risk a panic. For some minutes they walked on in silence, lost in thought. Then Granville said, "What about checking NMR machines? I don't know if we'd have the resources to start checking random bits of equipment that may or may not have been used, especially considering this is almost certainly the work of foreigners. It might be easier than you think. Whoever did this would almost certainly need access to a pretty decent NMR machine. Say you have some unknown chemical, something your genetically modified plants have secreted, but you're not sure if it's exactly what you hoped for or not. How do you determine whether you're on the right track? Any chemist worth his salt, or her," said Parsons, "or her salt, would inject a sample of the chemical into an NMR. The NMR subjects the substance to powerful magnetic fields, causing the substance to emit a spectrum of radiation. By examining different peaks in the radiation produced, it's possible to determine what chemical groups are present. They'd need other things too, chromatography columns and so on, but there could be lots of those in Britain. As for the really high-end NMR machines, I'd be willing to bet there are no more than 10 really top-notch machines in the whole country, but they're all being used by universities and large corporations. But the middle-of-range ones, I'd say there probably aren't more than 10,000 of those. Maybe it's even closer to 1,000. 10,000, said Parsons. Do you have any idea how thinly we're stretched right now? Tush, tush, man. If you can give me proper authority, I'll have some of my graduate students start looking into it by telephone. Well, said Parsons sceptically, I suppose it could be worth a try. How many grad students have you got? I can get 10 on it right away. Granville's students proved surprisingly effective. After only 2 weeks, they had produced a list of 25 suspicious machines. In each case, either the whereabouts of the machine was unknown, but might be uncovered by the proper exercise of police powers, or else the machine was in the hands of a private individual. Parsons found he couldn't quite decide whether Granville's idea represented a wild goose chase or was actually worthwhile, but he set a detective on the trail of the machines anyway. Sandra was growing weak with despair and hunger. After a period she estimated to be between 5 and 10 days, when she had been fed irregularly but approximately daily, she now hadn't been given any food for several days. When her captor again returned to bring food, she began to shout, almost hysterically, "You can't keep me in here! What do you want from me?" "I'd like to give you an injection," said a voice. She recognised the voice. It was the voice of the old man she had helped in the car park. Immediately she launched into a flurry of desperate questions, but he didn't reply. Only when she fell silent and began to cry did he speak again. "I will bring you more food. You can have something nice, a special treat. You can tell me what you want, but first I must administer an injection. No injection, no food." "What kind of injection?" "That doesn't matter. Will you take the injection or won't you?" "I won't," shouted Sandra. The footsteps trudged away and the outer door closed. When the inner door opened, a fresh bucket stood there, but no food. She exchanged it for the other bucket and lay weakly on the mattress. The inner door pulled itself shut. The old man returned perhaps a day later. "Are you ready to accept the injection?" he asked. "What is it?" said Sandra nervously. "Nothing bad," said the old man. "I'm not having it unless you tell me what it is." The old man sighed. I'm carrying out some research on the benefits of vitamin B injections. It's just vitamin B. I don't believe you. Fine, he said. No food today then. And he went away. Only after another 3 days, when she was extremely weak and her ribs were beginning to look excessively prominent, did she agree to the injection. The old man opened the hatch in the door from the outside. She looked through but couldn't see him. He was apparently standing carefully to the side of the hatch. Roll up your sleeve and present your upper arm to the opening, he said. She did as he asked, shaking silently. She had inwardly accepted that she was probably going to die, but a part of her clung to the hope that this sick old crank really was carrying out research on vitamin B. He injected her from a small syringe. Good, he said. For a minute he watched her, saying nothing, staying well back in the darkness of the corridor between the two doors, refusing to respond to her questions, while she rubbed the spot on her arm where the needle had gone in. Then he sighed again, with an odd note of disappointment. I want food, said Sandra. Lasagna will do nicely. You can get it from a supermarket and just heat it up. Very well, said the old man. When he returned about an hour later, he left a hot beef lasagna in the corridor, along with bread, cheese and a plastic spoon. She devoured it eagerly, while wondering what he had injected her with. Why had he seemed disappointed? What had he been expecting to happen to her? At certain points her anxiety grew to the extent that she almost stopped eating, but she persuaded herself to continue. There are only two approaches to surviving in such a situation, she reasoned. One must choose between unshakable faith in eventual escape, or else complete resignation, even to the possibility of death itself. She wasn't ready to embrace death yet. Embracing irrational and unreasoning faith had to be her course of action. But faith alone wouldn't be enough. She had to find a possible means of escape, something she could believe in. It was while eating the lasagna that she had an idea. It was a long shot, but it might work. We've whittled the list down to just 2 people, said Parsons, an unusual degree of excitement shining out from his ordinarily somewhat dour demeanour. One of them can almost be ruled out. He's nearly 80 years old and he has a respectable record of government work. I'm 90% sure the other fellow is the one we want, if our man owns an NMR machine and acquired it through ordinary channels. He's 40 years old, he's written some rather fruity stuff on social media, and he's a recluse. Well, why hasn't he been arrested? Asked Granville plaintively. This is theoretically still a free country. We can't just arrest people because they bought a perfectly legal machine and seem a bit shifty. Search his house at least. That's not so easy either. We're trying to obtain special permission from the Home Secretary. You know what the Home Secretary's like. All words and no sense. Oh, for heaven's sake, said Granville, in exasperation. The leaves on the trees were already turning brown and falling, leaving little piles at the side of the quiet road. Granville shivered and pulled his jacket more tightly around himself. Parsons was practically chain-smoking some sort of awful cigarillo. Don't worry, said Parsons. We're watching him like a hawk. If he so much as buys a pint of milk, I'll know about it. The moment we get authorization, we'll get straight in there and find out exactly what he's up to. What has he been writing on social media? Crazy stuff. He thinks society's deteriorating genetically. He says the worst people often have the most children. I don't know if that counts as crazy. You should see our latest student intake. Half of them barely read. That may be, but if we're looking for someone who hates people enough to get into the business of mass murder, I'd say he's our man. Time for another injection. Your arm, please. I'm not feeling well, said Sandra. Can we do it tomorrow? No, said the old man. The injection is ready now. I'll do it tomorrow, not before. Then you won't eat till tomorrow. I'll take the injection, just not today. No food today, said the old man, and he sighed heavily and went away. Pressing her ear against the metal door, she could hear his footsteps retreating. The space beyond the cell door sounded large and echoey. After a minute, the door buzzed and unlocked. An empty bucket stood in the corridor and a roll of toilet paper. There was no food. Working quickly, she took the plastic wrap she had saved from the bread and stuffed it into the 2 holes where the bolts of the door slid home into the doorframe. On the floor, she placed a separate piece of plastic wrap with a knot in one end, sliding the knot behind the door. Then she took the bucket and the toilet roll back into her cell. The door buzzed again and she heard the lock mechanism click, but it sounded subtly different to usual. She waited around 12 hours, as best she could judge it, before she tried the door. She pulled cautiously on the plastic wrap underneath the door. The door opened, but only slightly. As she hoped, the bolts had not been able to slide home. She pulled at the door with her fingers, exerting all her strength, and finally it sprang open. She took the bucket back into the little corridor and pulled the door shut behind her. Now it was time to wait. Horace Ableton was in the middle of a chemical synthesis when he heard the knock at the door. With a yell of exasperation, he turned off the hot plate and went to see who it was. If there was one thing Horace couldn't stand, it was unscheduled callers, or callers of any kind for that matter. After all, that was why he had taken the old farmhouse in the countryside. He opened the door and immediately 3 policemen barged in, waving a search warrant. They were quickly followed by numerous other people, some wearing biohazard suits. "What is this?" he said in a tone of voice, simultaneously expressing shock and anger. "This is an outrage. I'm a law-abiding individual. We have authorization to search this property," said Parsons. "But why?" asked Horace plaintively. "We don't have to tell you that, sir," said Parsons. "However, if there is anything you'd like to tell us, now is the time." "What? Of course you have to tell me. I have rights." "At this time, sir, we are not arresting you, so we don't have to give you a reason for the search. I will be writing to my MP about this. This is absolutely outrageous and disgusting." "You do that, sir," said Parsons. Horace watched helplessly as the biohazard people carried equipment and chemicals out of his front door and into a waiting van. "I need those," he said, almost apoplectic with rage. "I need them for my work." "And what is your work, sir, precisely?" said Parsons calmly. "That's none of your business, and you wouldn't understand if I told you. I'm engaged in important research." "Don't worry, you'll get it back, assuming it's all legal." A voice shouted, "Inspector, you might want to come and see this." Parsons spoke to the officers flanking him. "Arrest him if he tries to leave." Then he went to see what his team had found. In the basement was a large laboratory, complete with dozens of racks of test tubes and an NMR machine, which by now Parsons could easily identify on sight. "Looks like he's been pretty busy, Inspector," said the police constable standing next to him. "Do you reckon we've got him?" "If I was a betting man, I'd put 100 quid on it." Sandra had almost fallen asleep when the sound of footsteps roused her to full consciousness. She jumped to her feet and pressed herself against the hinged side of the door, holding the bucket. It opened and the old man entered, quite unsuspecting, holding a syringe. She banged the bucket onto his head, pushed him as hard as she could towards the cell, and ran out, pulling the door to behind her. The man started scrabbling at the unlocked door, trying to get a purchase on it. She quickly spotted the controls for locking and unlocking the door, red and green switches by the door itself. She locked it. The man immediately began pounding on the cell door, shouting. She found herself in a large room with 7 other steel doors leading off in different directions, and stairs leading upwards in the corner. Sandra went around unlocking all the doors. Then she began to open them one after the other, expecting to find more prisoners. 5 of the cells were empty. 1 contained a corpse in a bag, emitting an oddly faint but definitely discernible odour of decaying flesh, mixed with a chemical smell. The 7th contained an unbagged corpse, a young man, horribly contorted, as if he had died in agony. It seemed as though he had died fairly recently. She was about to run up the metal stairs in the corner when the door of the cell where the old man had kept her burst open, and there was the old man, syringe raised in his hand. Evidently he had some way of opening the door from the inside that she didn't know about. "It's time for your injection," he shouted. She bolted for the stairs. He almost managed to jab her with the needle, but she managed to kick his head with her foot. "Please," he shouted, "take the injection. I believe it works now. You will go down in history." She emerged into a perfectly ordinary living room. She ran into a dimly lit hall and yanked at the house's front door. It was locked. The old man was making his way unsteadily through the living room. "Sandra," he shouted. "I know your name is Sandra. It's on your driver's license. Sandra, you need to take the injection. It's just a little injection." She fumbled with the door lock frantically and removed the little chain, but the door still wouldn't open. With a sinking heart, she realised it must be locked separately with a key. "There you are, Sandra," said the old man, emerging into the hall. "Let's get this over with." He was holding the needle as though it was a dagger that he intended to plunge into her neck. Suddenly, a strange sense of calm came over her. The old man was weak, and having a bucket smashed down on his head hadn't done him any good. "Inject me then," she said, rolling up her sleeve. "Obviously I've no choice." "Good girl," said the old man, smiling insincerely. When he was about to push the needle into her arm, she grabbed his wrist, twisted it with all her strength, and plunged the needle into his neck, pushing down the plunger. For a moment there was a look of terror frozen on his face, as though he had seen something truly horrifying, his eyes fixed on an imaginary middle distance beyond the door. Then he crumpled to the ground. "Vitamin's my foot," said Sandra. She was about to go and look for the door key, when the door behind her was smashed in with tremendous force. She whirled around, staggering backwards away from the door, only to see a collection of policemen appear in the doorway. A smartly dressed man with a grey moustache in a brown overcoat strode forwards, as other policemen rushed past her into the house, 2 of them stopping to examine the old man on the floor. "Sandra Daniels," said Parsons. "Don't worry, ma'am, we're here to save you." Sandra began to laugh, with a torrent of mixed emotions, tears in her eyes. "Looks like she's saved herself, Inspector," said one of the policemen, feeling the old man's pulse. "Dead?" asked Parsons. "As a doornail," said the policeman. In the 5 Trees public house, a smiling Granville congratulated Inspector Parsons over a pint of ale. "So, unfortunately," Parsons was saying, "we're not going to be able to interrogate him." "This Sandra Daniels sounds like quite a woman," said Granville. "Yes, a quite remarkable character," Parsons agreed. "It's unfortunate we wasted so much time investigating that other fellow, but he really fitted the profile well, and Sidney Asquith really didn't. You know, Granville, one thing you learn in my line of work is people tend to calm down as they get older. We very rarely have any problems with the elderly. Once the people on the Daniels case figured out she'd been bundled into a car in a car park and traced the car to Asquith, we realised we'd made a huge mistake. Do you know how many people he killed in his basement? We found the remains of 8, plus there's Sandra. She probably would have been the final victim of his experiments. We think he was trying to develop a new kind of poison that he could get genetically engineered wild grass to express in its pollen. He just couldn't get it right. He injected her with it once and it didn't touch her. But this last injection, the one she stuck in his neck, that one worked very well. If we hadn't stopped him, he would have covered Britain with toxic pollen inside a year or 2. Porton Down tells me probably half of Britain would have died, and he probably would have had a go at the continent too. My colleagues are asking me what floated his boat. Was he left wing, right wing or what? Why did he do it? Parsons shook his head. There are some of us at the yard who think he really did it just because he could. He wanted to see what would happen. He has left us a huge rambling manifesto of sorts though. Quite hard to categorise it. He says technology will enslave us and render us weak and purposeless. But then he develops an idea he calls the forward escape, where he says some brave genius will come forwards, such as himself, who will use technology to save us from technology. And what do you think? Parsons laughed quietly, stirring into his ale. I think the man was a sad case of a great mind gone absolutely crackers, he said. Thank you for listening. You've been listening to Science Horror. My name's John Purcell and I write all the stories on this channel. If you enjoyed this story, please move into a hut in the forest and spend all your time writing manifestos. Thank you so much. I don't really care what the manifestos say, as long as they basically tell people to click the like and subscribe buttons on my videos. I'm not completely sure what I'm going to read next week, but I have started work on a story in which someone develops a new kind of technology which starts barking orders at him. So do join me again next week for that, or whatever I manage to come up with by next Monday. Your presence is greatly appreciated. Until then, have a good week and sleep well.